It is time for us to check in with CTV tech analyst Carmi Levy. A couple of stories in the news, Carmi, this week. Perhaps the most concerning, OpenAI, it turns out, and we saw this story break earlier in the week, did not respect Canadian privacy laws when it trained ChatGPT. Now, what I found interesting here is, correct me if I'm wrong, how many times have we heard the same sort of story, not from a government entity, but just in general?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we know this. It was first introduced in late 2022, and almost from that first moment, we realized we had crossed a privacy line. And now we have, even though we suspected it all along, now our privacy commissioners here in Quebec, as well as BC, Alberta, and the federal privacy commissioner, they've all kind of gotten together and issued a report basically saying, yeah, this is exactly what happened. The company over-collected on personal information, including health information, political views, even on our kids, as it was preparing ChatGPT to go to market, as it was getting all the data together to train it, that it didn't ask Canadians permission to do this, and that if we went and looked up ourselves on the platform, even to today, there are a lot of incorrect responses on us. They get it wrong all the time, and users don't have the ability to make that change. If they get it wrong about me, there's no real sort of process in place for me to ask them to change it. So they're basically saying, this violates Canada's privacy regulations on a whole number of fronts, and that needs to change. And quite frankly, given the fact that we're moving into using AI for everything, we don't Google things as much as we AI them now. We go to ChatGPT to get our answers. That's incredibly problematic because it means these companies are not following the rules, and that's putting Canadians at risk.
With respect to what can happen, so it's one thing when an individual or a company accuses them of that. Here you have a government getting involved. Does this make a difference?
It certainly does. It gives it credibility because it's no longer anecdotal. This is a 3-year investigation that was prompted by complaints from Canadians that their privacy had been compromised, that something was not quite right, the process was not as transparent as it should have been. So it certainly moves us in the right direction, and I think this is, by definition, a good thing. What is frustrating, though, is that the privacy commissioners themselves have said the law as we have it limits our ability to do something about it. In other words, they can't punish OpenAI. They can ask them to make changes, and they have, and the company has said their newer models address much of the issues uncovered in this report, but they can't punish them. They can't fine them. There's no teeth to anything because the Privacy Act was introduced in 1983, long before any of this technology came along. And so it doesn't deal specifically with data scraping and harvesting and all the sort of the digital privacy things, the issues that we face today. So they're calling on the federal government to get moving on updating that Privacy Act to make sure that it includes references, specific ones, to these technologies so that the next time this happens, they can then punish these companies and force them to behave properly.
All right, so no topic for us would be complete when we do our segment without discussing AI because, well, we just did. Now there's another story, the Oscars, and I find this interesting because this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue with respect to the creative arts, right? The Oscars now say AI, I'm using this in quotation mark, actors and writing cannot win awards going forward. What does this mean?
It means basically they want to retain the sanctity of the acting profession and make sure that when you watch the Oscars, when a film is nominated, that it is largely the result of a human endeavor, not a technological one. So they're saying that if a film is to be eligible for nomination, it can only include acting that is demonstrably performed by humans, and it can only be based on writing that is human authored. And that's a pretty clear line in the sands, and it kind of takes a shot at films like As Deep as the Grave. That's Val Kilmer's last film. Right. His family approved that the producers would use AI creations because, of course, he was no longer able to go in front of camera because he died last year. So that film, by this definition, would not be eligible for an Oscar if someone wanted to nominate it. Same deal with Tilly Norwood, who was an AI-created actor that their creators are trying to shop around. So far, no takers. Anything involving her also would not be eligible for an Oscar. And I think it's important for us to establish these rules. We're talking about the entertainment industry today, but every industry should be looking at this as an example and going, we really need rules of our own. Otherwise, people just make it up as they go along, and you end up with just utter chaos.
I wonder, though, when I saw the headline, I said, why not just create a separate category for AI, right? You could still be able to make AI movies or have AI actors, et cetera, but not compete against, traditional films that have real humans.
Yeah, I think the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, their concern was that if they set that up separately, that would affect their overall brand. In other words, it's almost like Hollywood accepting the fact that technology can replace humans. What they did instead, though, was that they did not ban AI explicitly in the production of films. So if, for example, you're creating a scene that you would normally use a lot of CGI, difficult to reproduce with cameras, and you can use AI technology to enhance it or create it in a safer, more cost-effective way, that's still within scope, and that still does not mean that you can't nominate it for an Oscar. So they're starting the conversation. They're starting with just these two edicts. The conversation obviously will continue over time. It wouldn't surprise me at some point if we saw more clarity on the inclusion of AI in the process, just not replacing humans, maybe complementing them.
All right, let me move on to this next story. Oh, look, it's an AI story too. It turns out more than a third of all new podcasts are now AI generated, which is interesting because the whole idea was, the idea of podcasts began to spread. The old story is everybody has a podcast, but they were all humans. Apparently not anymore.
Yeah, so there's a website called Podcast Index, and they issue something called the New Feeds Report, and it keeps track of who's posting podcasts, how many are out there, and where are they coming from. And so they started to differentiate between human podcasts and technologically created ones, and they shone the light on this group called Inception Point AI. They've got 5,000 total podcasts under their umbrella, and they're cranking out 3,000 episodes every week, all generated by AI, which sounds really frightening and those numbers, they've been tracking them over time, continue to go up over time. The good news, though, is that even if these things are being cranked out, and they're becoming increasingly difficult to tell the difference when you're, say, listening on Apple Music or Spotify or other platforms because they're not always properly labeled. There are a lot of them there, and they're flooding out other forms of podcasts, but their listener numbers aren't keeping pace. So even if they're being released, doesn't mean that they're finding an audience. Listeners still want to hear humans. They want to make connections with them, and you certainly can't do that if the podcast is entirely created in code.
I just, again, in trying to understand why this would be a thing, and maybe that's a problem to begin with, is the idea that you don't know or you don't think as you watch this that you're not watching real people? I mean, what would be the advantage of watching an AI podcast?
Because in many cases, it isn't even people who are listening to it. So, for example, YouTube has the same problem, lots of AI-generated content. And statistics and some reports have suggested that that content is actually playing to bots. It's playing to non-human viewers and listeners. And as a result, it's generating revenue for whoever owns the channel. And of course, it doesn't cost a whole lot to generate AI-generated content.
Nice.
So it isn't about quality. It isn't about human connection. It isn't about making a podcast that will be remembered for the ages. It is about using or playing the system, gaming the system to generate views, which of course generates ad revenue and generates revenue for whoever runs that channel.
We live in a very strange world now, don't we, technologically?
Yeah, and cynical, because quite frankly, this has nothing to do with, podcasts that matter. It has everything to do with playing with the system and just squeezing out revenue until they change the rules. And then, of course, there will be something else that we can talk about.
It's someone who figured out how to game the system, right? That's basically what it is.
Precisely. It isn't about making people happy. And I think, the good news, though, is, I listen to podcasts as well, and some of my favorites involve people who I know, most of them from the media industry, because I've followed them for years. I have relationships with them. I think they have really great things to say. And I think now that we're being flooded by AI-generated content, the value of human-generated content is becoming obvious to us. We realize we either follow these people who are still working hard to create good content, or we lose them for good. And so I think that it's driving engagement on the podcasts that matter, and frankly, by extension, radio as well. This is why we listen to radio too. It's all about the people, and technology will never change that.
Carmi Levy, CTV tech analyst. Carmi, thank you so much.
Appreciate it, Aaron. Thank you.
I'm Luke Wilson. Join me each week for Film Never Lies. Since retiring from the NFL, I've had a lot on my mind, and now I've got my own show. So if you're tired of lazy takes, if you want honest conversations, join us each week. Film Never Lies, available on all TSN platforms and the iHeartRadio app.